Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the information noise to bring you the essential insights you need.
Quickly and thoroughly.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into an urgent and, frankly, very complex crisis. It's the persistent and organized violence against Christian communities in Nigeria.
Right, and it's something that often gets obscured by these really vague headlines.
Exactly. When you look at the source material we've reviewed, the claim is this isn't random crime. It's described as systematic, targeted persecution.
And that gravity is definitely reflected on the global stage. I mean, we're talking about a situation that has drawn immediate, very high-level international attention.
Such as?
Well, it's important to note that Pope Leo XIV, very early in his pontificate, condemned these acts. He made this clear appeal for, the warring parties to protect civilians, stop the violence, and actually commit to dialogue.
So this is not being viewed as just some regional skirmish?
No, not at all. It's a recognized global tragedy.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission today is to use the analysis from the sources we've reviewed, including a very prominent Catholic commentator, to identify what they call the 4 clear interlocking drivers that keep this horrific cycle of violence turning.
Which is so important.
Right. The goal for you, the listener, is to move far beyond a superficial news report that might just label this as clashes, between farmers and herders, and really understand the specific mechanisms at play.
And understanding those mechanisms is absolutely paramount, because if you misdiagnose the cause, if you call targeted violence a simple land dispute, then any proposed solution is going to fail.
Whether it's foreign aid or diplomatic pressure?
Exactly. It'll fail to address the root problem.
Okay, so let's start with the first factor the analysis identifies, the core aggressor. This is characterized as an extremist Fulani campaign. The simple narrative you often hear is that the Fulani are cattle herders, and they're invading farming communities to find pasture. On the surface, it sounds like a classic resource battle, right?
It does. It absolutely sounds like a resource battle. But the sources we looked at push back so hard on that simplicity.
How so?
Well, the claim is that the very nature of these assaults just completely contradicts that simple pastoral dispute narrative. These are not just incursions. They're extremely well organized and, crucially, heavily armed.
So we're not talking about shepherds just driving their cows.
No. We're talking about groups arriving with high-powered automatic weapons. Machetes. It's a different level of violence entirely.
So what are the specifics that really dismantle that communal conflict label? Because, lots of places in the world have resource conflicts.
It's the pattern and the targeting. That's what the analysis points to again and again. These armed groups systematically target predominantly Christian farming villages.
Okay.
The attacks often happen far from traditional grazing routes. They involve the burning of churches and schools, and they often include acts of violence that have nothing to do with resources, like sexual assault or forced conversions.
It's organized destruction.
Exactly. It's aimed at cultural and religious erasure, not just grazing rights.
That distinction is just. It's vital. It changes the definition of the conflict immediately. And the sources give these specific heartbreaking examples, the kidnapping of priests and nuns, for example.
Right. And assassinations of Catholic leaders.
The victim pool is just so overwhelmingly Christian, which suggests a deliberate religious motivation that goes way beyond a dispute over land.
And that's the evidence the commentator uses to build the case, the selection of the targets. If it were a neutral conflict, you'd expect leaders and buildings from both communities to be hit equally.
But they're not.
They're not. The focus on Christian clergy and religious sites implies an ideological motive, not a purely economic one.
That level of systematic targeting brings us right to the second factor, which just amplifies the whole thing. It's the organized collaboration between these Fulani groups and, other powerful actors.
Islamist militants and criminal gangs.
Right.
And what's crucial for you to understand here is that this is not just local banditry. Our sources point out that a branch of the Islamic State, ISWAP, operates actively in Nigeria.
And they're collaborating directly with some of these Fulani elements.
Directly. And this alliance provides resources, training, and a radical ideological framework for what's happening.
It's like pouring tactical gasoline on a fire. It gives it structure.
Precisely. This alliance elevates the violence from, armed, chaotic disputes into organized terror, systematic persecution. These militants are described as well-funded, professionally armed, and capable of executing these complex multi-day raids.
Which leads directly to the third factor, because you can have armed and organized aggressors, but the violence wouldn't persist without a critical enabler,
The enabler.
which is factor three,
Betty.
political protection and the impunity that comes with it. The sources point right at alleged political alliances as being a core part of the problem.
This is maybe the most sensitive and important claim in the entire analysis. The core argument is one of structural impunity. The sources allege that recent Nigerian leadership, which includes a Muslim president and prime minister, form political alliances or have ties that are seen to either actively protect the attackers or, more often, just consistently fail to punish them.
That's a huge claim. What specific details do the sources offer to back that up, to show its bias and not just, incompetence or corruption?
The evidence they cite isn't a smoking gun, like a direct order. It's more about the visible outcomes of a systemic failure.
Okay.
The sources detail this consistent pattern. Fulani groups and Islamist militants carry out massive raids. They kill dozens, burn entire villages, and then they just retreat.
And what happens next?
Nothing. Almost no major arrests, no trials, no prosecution of the perpetrators who are often known.
So the political system effectively acts as a shield. The failure to prosecute is the mechanism that turns this into a sustained low-stakes campaign for the attackers.
Yes, they know they can act without consequences. This absence of accountability, this impunity, it sends a clear message and just lets the cycle continue.
Yeah.
It turns a police problem into a terror campaign that operates with what feels like tacit government permission.
So we have the aggressor, the extremist Fulani groups, we have the escalation from the Islamist militants, and we have the infrastructure that allows it, which is political impunity.
Right.
And that brings us to the fourth and final factor, which kind of shifts the lens from the ground to the global stage. It's the narrative battle. The source actually calls it the climate alibi.
And this one is all about how the outside world chooses to understand or misunderstand the conflict.
Okay.
International observers, especially in Western media and policy circles, often explain the Nigerian violence as a struggle over farmland, aggravated by climate change.
You hear that a lot. Resource competition because of changing weather patterns.
And that sounds reasonable on the surface. Climate change is a driver of instability everywhere. Of course. But that's exactly why the sources call it an alibi. The claim is that this climate framing is a sanitized narrative that's designed to obscure the religious targeted nature of the attacks. It turns attackers from ideological militants into, victims of an environmental disaster.
How does the analysis dismantle that narrative, though, beyond just pointing to the burned churches?
By looking at who is not a victim, the argument is, if this were truly just random clashes over scarce resources caused by climate change, you'd see casualties distributed more evenly between Muslim and Christian communities.
But that's not what the data shows.
Not at all. The victims listed, the priests, the specific communities, the organized destruction, it all shows a clear religious pattern. The argument is that blaming it all on climate change misses the deliberate ideological goal of displacing and eliminating Christians from certain areas.
So the stakes here are really about global honesty. Does the world prefer a politically neutral explanation, like climate change, over a politically inconvenient one, like religious persecution?
That's the tension. And you can see that tension play out dramatically when you look at global responses. For example, the U.S. response under the Trump administration. They designated Nigeria a country of particular concern, or CPC.
Okay, for our listener, what exactly does a CPC designation mean in diplomatic terms?
It's a powerful tool. It's reserved for countries that engage in or tolerate systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. It's an escalation that can trigger restrictions on aid, trade, diplomatic engagement.
And it was based on the evidence we've been discussing.
Yes, specifically the systematic attacks, the kidnappings, the murders of clergy, and tying back to factor 3, the documented failure of local authorities to prosecute anyone for it.
And how was that designation received given the two competing narratives we just laid out?
A starkly divided reception. Religious right and freedom of religion advocates welcomed it, saying it was overdue recognition of persecution. But the sources note that many European commentators and organizations had a very different response.
They preferred the climate explanation.
They often did, yes. And the analysis suggests why. The argument is that secular European narratives often resist recognizing Christians as specific victims of targeted violence.
Why is that?
It's politically easier, the source argues, to treat it as a neutral humanitarian crisis than as a religious persecution that would require calling out an allied government.
That distinction is really the crucial takeaway here, isn't it? What you call it determines what you do about it.
Absolutely. The stakes are immense, and for you, the listener, it's so important to grasp this. How the world names the problem determines the global response. If it's climate change, the answer is development aid.
Adaptation funding.
Right. But if it's targeted persecution, it requires diplomatic pressure, sanctions, security intervention to hold authorities accountable. The source argues that labeling these killings a side effect of climate change risks whitewashing systematic, religiously motivated violence.
This has been an incredibly complex and heavy deep dive. But the structure from our sources makes the conclusion pretty clear for you, the learner. To really understand the violence in Nigeria, you have to move past that simple clashes narrative. You have to recognize the specific religious pattern, the militant alliances that escalate everything, and the political failures that lock the violence into this permanent, non-prosecuted cycle.
All sustained by that battle over the global narrative.
Exactly.
And that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to consider. Given the arguments we've discussed about how the climate alibi can obscure targeted persecution, and we all know resource scarcity is a real global problem, what are the specific objective criteria we should use when we look at violence in any contested region to determine if it's driven primarily by resource scarcity, or if those resource pressures are just being exploited by ideological groups to mask systematic targeting?
What evidence would you need?
Yeah. What evidence would you need to definitively separate those two factors? Something to think about.